Hey, so it's about time, so let's go ahead and get started. You've joined this session in Milepost 4. Um, my name is Kevin Rubesh. I'm here with Tim Hayes, and we'll be tag teaming this session to talk about how the U.S. Department of State is using Office 365 and Teams in particular to support global diplomacy. So this presentation is going to be a little bit different than most I've watched over the last 24 hours or so. We're not going to be sharing PowerShell snippets. We're not going to be sharing cool new products to help you work with the systems better, but rather trying to tell a story of how a very large organization that's spread all over the world has really used Microsoft products and Teams to accomplish what we need to do, particularly during this time of pandemic where things change dramatically. So first, a quick shout out to all of our sponsors. If you haven't seen the sponsors videos yet or put in your raffle entry, I'd encourage you to do that. They usually pop up after the keynote speeches. So introducing ourselves, Tim, you want to say a couple words about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, hi, good morning. As Kevin said, my name is Tim Hayes, and I work in an office called the Office of E-Diplomacy in Washington, D.C., and our major role is both knowledge management and change management. So when Teams and Office 365 came around, we saw this as a great opportunity to look at better ways for us to do knowledge management within the State Department. And so that's how we have been playing this role and working with Microsoft Teams over the last couple of years. And back to you, Kevin.
Great. So my name is Kevin Rubesh. So while Tim is in DC, I'm here in sunny London. It's always like this, I guarantee it never rains here. And I'm what's called a Foreign Service Specialist. So I'm a diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. Every 3 years I get assigned to a different post overseas. London is my 7th post in sequence. I've been in Africa, I've been in the Middle East, I've been in Central America, and it's really been a great way to use information technology. My key role is to use IT to accomplish our objectives overseas. So I'm the Information Technology Director now for the US mission to the UK. So that's our embassy in London and our consulates in Belfast and Edinburgh. And my team supports a little bit over 1,000 customers across those 3 locations. So just as a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about, in case you wanted to switch to a more technical session, we're just going to go over a background of how we got started with Teams, what it meant as COVID-19 hit us and we had to scale up to a very different way of doing business, how we're using Teams, both at the department level centrally and out in the field at embassies and consulates, and then some kind of case studies and perspective from here in London and from other posts around the world. And then some of the challenges that we see going forward. What happens when we go back to the new normal, whatever that may be. But first, just some background on what is the Department of State. So we're federal employees. We are the agency that leads America's foreign policy. So that means that we develop and we maintain diplomatic relationships with other nations, with multilateral organizations like the UN or NATO. We advocate for the interests and economic prosperity of American people and companies, and we protect the safety of American citizens overseas. So particularly now during the pandemic, as an example, we have repatriated or moved back to the US over 95,000 American citizens on over 1,000 flights from 136 countries. So a lot of the work we've been focused on in the last couple months is getting Americans back to the US and helping them out here in the country. So the department, it's not huge by US government agency standards, but it's larger than most companies. We have over 75,000 employees worldwide. About 65,000, close to that, are working at overseas locations, and about 10,000 in offices within the US. And about 45,000 of our employees are foreign nationals of the country in which our foreign post is. So in the case of the UK, UK citizens or third country nationals who are in the country. We're spread widely. So we have over 275 different diplomatic posts overseas, and then dozens of domestic locations in the US as well. And when I joined about 20 years ago, we were a Microsoft shop. We're still a Microsoft shop, but what that means has changed quite a bit. I think one of my first projects was migrating us to Windows NT from old Wang systems. But the most dramatic change has happened probably within the last 2 years or a little bit longer, where we've started the transition to the Microsoft cloud and away from on-premises servers. So what the method used to be was all of our data was stored in server rooms at each of the 275 embassies or consulates around the world. And that has limiting factors we're going to talk to a little bit later. So it's been exciting. It's been a little bit scary too, as we move from systems that we control on premises up to this nebulous thing called the cloud. But it's also given us a tremendous amount of additional capacity and capabilities that we didn't have before. So at this point, Tim, I'm going to turn it back over to you to kind of talk about how we went about getting teams initiated in the department.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so we started with teams back in October of 2018, and we had been doing a lot of work with groups, and we knew that teams were coming. There had been some discussion on it, and we decided that we wanted to have a go slow approach for this. I mean, part of it was we weren't quite certain exactly how teams were going to work. We weren't certain how people were going to approach it. So we set up what was called the player coach model. And let me just explain that a little bit. It was quite a useful concept for us. When we first started, during our pilot, we had anyone who wanted to set up a team as an owner was someone who had to request a team. And before we gave them or set up the team for them, we did not allow people to set up their own teams. We made them read this player coach model. And essentially what it said was, you're the coach and everybody on your team members are the players. And before they go to the help desk, in particular, asking questions about what they can do in teams, they need to come to you as the coach. And our main concern was that there were going to be a lot of support questions, that there were going to people were going to be not certain, and that a lot of the questions were going to be more or less, how do I questions? How do I do something in teams? How do I create a channel? Or why can't I create a channel? And we wanted to avoid all those questions going to our help desk because they are always flooded with requests, and we didn't want to introduce these new type of questions. We ran that pilot for a couple of months. We ended up with around 1,000 users spanning over just a couple hundred teams. It wasn't a large amount, and we found that to be very successful. Over that 3 to 4 month time period, we only had 3 or 4 calls to our help desk worldwide, and what we found was teams technically there were no real issues with it, and most of the questions were in fact ones that the coach could answer. We had team sites set up, we had communications venues set up so that the coaches, if they had questions, could come to us. The other thing that we did is we initiated remote access to Office 365. That was not just tied into Teams, but it was a limited remote access, and it was a way for people to get to some of the other Office 365 applications, Outlook in particular. So at the end of the pilot, we decided that we weren't ready to start and just open this up for the entire department. So we adopted word of mouth expansion approach. We wanted to have a very measured approach as we went forward. So we saw continued expansion. We realized that the player coach model was successful. And again, there were 2 components to that. Number one is that the coaches were accepting their responsibility, but the other is that we also had a good way for us to communicate with the coaches. So they were feeding information back to us. It was helping us understand what some of the issues were, and then we were able to feed information back to them. One of the major factors in Teams is, as you all are probably aware, is that the application continues to develop. So there are changes coming. So we needed to get in front of those. We needed to let the coaches know what was happening so they could be advising their players. We saw our user base grow to around 4,000. We saw the remote access steadily increase. people were really starting to like it. We have a VPN solution for remote access, which allows people to essentially get into our full enterprise network. That's somewhat limited in the number of people that can access at a certain time. Also, the access requirements were quite a bit more stringent. So what people found was it was much easier to use this remote access. The remote access had two components to it. One is it allowed people to get the Microsoft applications on their mobile devices. That's really where people enjoyed it the most in the beginning, but it also allowed them to come in from their home computers and through multi-factor authentication, be able to get into the cloud. And as Kevin said, the cloud is a new environment for us, and it's taking a while for people to understand, but it allows people to get into the cloud. They're sandboxed inside of their browser, but they can still get to a fair amount of information. The one other thing that we started in this time is we started actually using Teams as a support device for Teams. So we created a team that we call the Teams Learning and Support Team. We have found this to be very successful. It evolved from our player coach model from the beginning of it. And we saw the number of members in this team has been steadily growing. It started in the high hundreds, 700-800 people initially. As we've gotten into the pandemic stages, we've now seen it grow to over 4,000 people. So that's a very active team. It's a good way for us to get information out and to exchange information, as I said, so we can hear the concerns that users are having about Teams. At the same time, we can feed information back to them. We had another sort of seminal event in September of 2019. We had a global IMO conference, and IMO stands for Information Management Officer, and that's the State Department lingo for Kevin's position. So it's the senior IT pro at all of our embassies. So we had this global conference, and we used Teams to organize and manage the agenda. And that was really, really very helpful, because what it did is it introduced Teams to power users and to power users around the world. And it was really, I found it very interesting to be at that conference and watch people starting to communicate on Teams. And once again, in particular, the mobility of it. So they could be using their phones. They were organizing social events, but they were also seeing the agenda for the conference. And a lot of good interaction was going on. Shortly after this conference was done, we saw the user base grow to 12,000. And essentially what happened, those IT pros went back to their embassies. We started to see the growth of Teams really much more to embassies that we did in our domestic facilities. And that's kind of where we were standing in the beginning of this year and just a few months ago when the pandemic hit. So what happened when the pandemic hit? Obviously, we went to max telework. We easily went over 80% of our workforce around the world. And all of a sudden, people needed to use Teams. They needed to use it, especially for meetings and for calls. We had some other solutions. We found even some of our conference cards were, all of these different platforms were becoming overwhelmed. And so as an end result, Teams got introduced on a much larger scale. As I said, we were doing this all very measured. All of a sudden at once, over the space of just a few weeks, we saw the user base grow from that 10 or 12,000 we were sitting at to where it is today, which is at 39,000. So that's where we are today. We have a lot more people on Teams. There's been an expansive use of it. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin so he can talk a little bit about actually how it's being used overseas, and so he can tell you some of the advantages of it versus how we were operating before.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So I've titled this slide, When You Need a New Plane. If there's anything this job has taught me, it's that you have to be ready to respond to the unexpected. You never know what the next day is going to bring you. Before I was assigned to London, I was in Tokyo, Japan, And that was during a time when North Korea was kind of beginning to flex its muscles, exercise its nuclear capabilities. We were much in the news, and it was a big concern, and that kind of sets the geographic political situation. So it was about 4:31 Saturday morning, and the phone rings, and it's my boss on the phone, and I'm kind of groggy, hazy from the early morning call, not quite awake. And I thought I heard, we need you to fix a plane. Now, I've been an IT guy for decades, and I'm used to being jack of all trades, but I have to admit my knowledge of avionics is pretty weak. Well, when I got my coffee and woke up, turns out what had happened was the Secretary of State Tillerson at that time was en route to China to discuss the Korea situation with the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. And the secretary's plane had stopped at a U.S. airbase not far from Tokyo to refuel, and while it was on the ground, it broke. So not sure what happened, but it couldn't make it all the rest of the way to Beijing. So my job was to head out to the airfield, go up to the broken plane, tear out all the classified communications equipment out of it, stick it on a truck across the tarmac to a new plane, and set it all back up so that the airplane could get back in the air and continue the mission. Certainly not the way I was expecting to spend my Saturday morning. But the similarities between that and a couple months ago, if you fast forward to about February, March timeframe in 2020, as COVID was coming our way, and we realized that we're going to have to change our operations pretty unexpectedly and pretty suddenly, kind of like we had to go fix our plane. So across the Department of State, here in London, at other foreign missions, and then in DC as well, we were forced to quickly take a dramatic change of course. So Tim mentioned that we had a VPN solution kind of as our primary remote access telework tool. Well, here in London, less than 20% of my customers, and that's over 1,000 users in my customer base, had access to real telework tools. So the question was, how do we transition them that fast to a system where they can actually do their primary work from their living rooms instead of their offices in less than 2 weeks? So we had to move from a model where virtually everyone worked in the office. We have very few teleworkers at all. To the next day where, in our case, over 90% of our team was expected to work from home and not come into the office anymore. And again, this is in the context of an organization which has always kept our data on premises in the office with only wired access to it, no Wi-Fi, limited remote access. So it represented a dramatic change. So the first thing we needed was the right tools. So just like before we headed out to the Secretary's plane, we grabbed our tool bags, made sure we had the right stuff we needed for the job. And it's the right tools in this case that have allowed us to remain productive and successful. So within the past 2 years in particular, due to the work of people like Tim at our headquarters, the department has created just that. It's the set of tools that our users have needed and have relied on to be successful during the pandemic. So we've been moving our data, now stored in 275 plus different data centers around the world, and accessible primarily from the local network up to the cloud, to a model where we're leveraging the power of collaboration in the cloud with Microsoft's Office 365 government cloud solution. So by doing that, we got dramatically expanded mobility, telework options, remote access options, while at the same time making sure that we met our strict information security standards. But the problem is that we almost had too many tools at first. Now, do they use SharePoint? Do we use OneDrive? Do we use Skype? How do you share information? There's so many different ways to do that. And what we found was that Teams became that one killer app for the cloud. It was the one platform that combined the multiple different tools of chats and meetings and collaboration and document editing into one interface that our users could understand. So the second thing we needed to do when our plane broke down in Japan was execute quickly. The secretary had to get back on the plane to head off to China and to complete his mission, and we couldn't dilly-dally around waiting for a perfect solution. We had to go with what we had. And our work towards adaptation of Teams in the department has been a longish process. We're like 2 years in now. And a lot of that is because it's been difficult to convince people to use these new tools that they have. So in a way, when the pandemic hit, though, that gave us the requirement to use the tools now that we hadn't had before, and forced our users to adopt these tools that we've been trying to push for the last 2 years. For us, the two enabling technologies for this were what Tim mentioned earlier: easier access via off-premises, so that our folks could go in via browser-based access to Office 365 and get to their content quickly. Very few of our 65,000 or so employees overseas had access, and a decision was made at a headquarters level, pretty much overnight it seemed like, from the field, that we're going to turn on this feature so that all of a sudden everybody who has an account on our corporate intranet can now get to our content that's on Office 365 via a browser at home, and our two-factor authentication and security logons. And that happened very quickly. And it was important that it happened quickly so that we could get people connected. And then the second enabling technology for us has been Teams. Video conferencing, kind of like the one we're doing now. They're the initial draw as we move people from meeting in conference rooms to meeting in living rooms across the country and even across the world. We have some staff that are evacuated to take care of family, and they're joining into conferences from places that are in a different country. But while they were there and enjoying video conferencing, they started chatting, they started creating channels, sharing content. And the model of decentralized setup, you don't need an IT guy to create a new channel or to organize content, really helped adaptation to spread quickly at the grassroots level. One thing we found that has been particularly useful has been active use by leadership within our organization. So that we found that within Embassy London, those sections, those organizations where the unit head didn't just say use SharePoint, but was actually use Teams, but actually on Teams themselves, and letting their staff mention them and incorporate them in conversations. For those groups, adaptation moved really quickly. And finally, you need to leverage your team. And that was my next call in the morning when the plane broke down, was to key team members who I knew could handle telephone issues, could handle radio issues, could handle our classified systems. They understood their roles. They're able to apply their skills pretty quickly in getting our plane fixed and back up in the air. And that was a big challenge for my team in particular. I have a team of about 35 technologists who are very good at what they do. They're network administrators, they're software developers, they're SharePoint folks, and all of a sudden they couldn't do their core work, their administrative functions on the network from home. And so the question is, what do they do? How do we keep them engaged? How do we reach out to our customers in a very different way when you're working in a very different fashion? And again, Teams gave us that platform to kind of direct that energy in the right place. We quickly stood up what we call our virtual help desk. So it's a public Teams site that all of our customers can hit. So if they have a question about how to use Teams, if they have a question about OneDrive or any of the other technology tools, they can head right to our team with a simple link. They can ask questions via chat. They can share desktops. They can do video chats. And it lets our technologists who are teleworking from home interact with their customers who are teleworking from home or around the world. And across our mission, we keep on hearing the same type of thing from our customers, that Teams is keeping people more in the loop than ever before. They're better able to collaborate projects. They can clear documents and paper better. And it lets them work across borders and time zones in a way that they've never been able to do before. So I wanted to turn back over to just some examples specifically of how we here in Mission UK, Embassy London, have used Teams. So there's the virtual help desk that I've mentioned. And again, that's a place where we can collaborate on documentation on the technical side. As we find ways to do things, we document it. We're tying in a feed on our Streams video channel for how-to videos. We have a lot of comments back and forth in chat, video chat, text chat with our customers. So that's been a key thing for us in teaching our customers how to use this new technology. It's very foreign to most of them. Our embassy has multiple different U.S. agencies represented. One is the Department of Homeland Security. So this is the time of year when they are typically doing a lot of bilateral meetings, meeting with their counterparts from the UK, from Canada, from New Zealand, from other organizations to discuss matters of mutual interest. And nobody's meeting in person anymore. And so what the DHS is doing is they're doing these meetings as virtual team sessions instead. Department of Defense. A lot of money is involved in Department of Defense contracts and issues. And there's a requirement to do hands-on training for budget analysts to certify that they're able to appropriately safeguard funds. That's typically done. Again, a trainer comes out to post, meets with the budget analysts, and gives them training in person. All that training is now happening via Teams between a trainer who's in Europe, in Germany, and the staff who are here on the ground in London. The free trade agreement is another big one. So come last January, the UK announced its decision to leave the European Union. Among other things, that means that any trade treaties that the US had with the EU, we would now need to negotiate specifically with the UK. And so there's work going on negotiating a free trade agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom. And again, this is something where typically we'd have a lot of in-person meetings, we'd have travel back and forth between posts, and now that's all shifted to online. So our teams here in the embassy who are working on negotiating those things connect with their counterparts in the government of the UK to negotiate and discuss options they need to do. Virtual handovers. So every 3 years is our typical assignment length. We have a whole new set of people coming into the embassy, and Teams has given us a great way to pass information down from person to person. So when I arrived in London, my predecessor had left like the month before. So we very rarely have any in-person handover time, and Teams gives us a great tool to be able to document issues and to be able to pass on to our successors in our role, and really allows people to be more productive as they come in. And then I mentioned too, document clearances. So a lot of the work we do is still bureaucratic. You draft a document, you get your boss's clearance, you send it to the other agency down the hall, they clear on it. And in the past, that's been something that's very difficult to do. You attach a document to an Outlook message, you send it, you make a change to it, you send it back, versions get out of control. With Teams, our folks are discovering how easy it is to do document collaboration across sections with that, and they can very easily incorporate changes and route things for clearance. Tim, you had some examples as well on a wider scale, right?
Yeah, so a couple of things that I wanted to throw out as some use cases and how Teams were really beneficial during the pandemic. And you know, from the headquarters, as we set up these new teams, even starting back 2 years ago, some of them that were interesting to us, we asked if we could stay on the teams as members, even though logically our office wouldn't be there, but it allowed us to get a view into how Teams was being used around the world by the department. And you know, early on, we had a consulate in Asia say that they wanted to join with Teams. We were a little reticent, but we finally did, because the leader of the consulate was very much involved and wanted to do this. And as Kevin said, leadership is really, really important as you look at change management and user adoption. So the concept was actually very successful with the team, but about January this year, they had to evacuate because they were in an area where you know, the coronavirus was spreading rapidly. And it was interesting to watch this team because we never saw the business change. Normally when people evacuate, and obviously in the State Department, we see that happen quite a bit. You end up with issues where people have trouble getting access to their email, they're not communicating well, it's difficult, often people end up on personal emails. None of this happened, and it was all because of Teams. They had their communication set up, the channels were well established, and the people just kept communicating. Similar to that, and when the pandemic started, as Kevin mentioned, we went through a huge repatriation effort. In order to do that, we have groups called the American Citizen Services at embassies and consulate around the world. They had to collect information about citizens. You can imagine people trying to call the embassy, emailing the embassy. Anyway, there was a huge effort of just collecting information. And what was the best way to do that? We set up a team, we helped set up a team where consular officers could come together from around the world and discuss in a single location how each of them were considering taking on this huge data collection effort. And best practices started to come out very rapidly. And once again, teams really facilitated that because people could share information so much faster and they could see each other's responses. And some of those best practices that were initially discussed on this team then made their way into what became the standard for each of the embassies and consulates around the world for how they were going to deal with helping to organize the repatriation. The last one that stands out and would be applicable to any organization like ours is we have an operations center. We have actually several operations centers. They operate 24/7. They need to be able to, share information across shifts, but also our main operations center, especially if you think about this repatriation, needs to share information with other federal agencies. And Teams became the platform where we could start to do that much more effectively. And so those are just a few of the examples that I've seen here from Washington. And what really allowed us to do that, and on this slide, we've had the graphs, but we actually put up the numbers because I think they're so impressive as far as what happened. So this is the number of people who were using calls or chat messages on our department instance. So in February 2020, there were 225 people who actually used calls. Compared to in April, you can see there were over 14,600 who did calls. The chat messages, there were a few more people chatting at the time, obviously just a little over 2,000 in February. That jumped up to over 21,000 in April. So you can see the scale up. The previous slide showed the number of people. These are the actual number of events. So we had 277 Teams calls in February across the entire month. Over the entire month of April, we had 37,897 calls. You can see here, I think this graphically shows the effort that we had to undertake in order to get people to this environment. We were fortunate. We had the remote access set up. A fair number of the people, certainly those who had been on the pilot, understood how to use Teams. But there was an education process, a communication process going on to allow people, even this number of people, to be able to participate in calls. The chat messages, similarly, we had 96,000 some in February. That bumped up to almost 4.5 million in April. So the chatting on Teams, and some of this you can see there's the beginning of moving from Skype for Business to Teams. Okay, this all didn't happen smoothly. I mean, it wasn't just turn it on, everything's going to happen. And I mentioned communications, and I think one of the critical pieces was especially in the first couple of weeks, there were enterprise-wide communications in multiple channels. We have some very formal communications that went out. There are informal communications, the various teams that I have mentioned, where we were spreading a lot of information. We were having to tell people to go to Teams. Some people could go to Teams and figure out how to do it. Others would get to Teams and not know what to do. So these communications were giving them avenues to find information, to try to find the information on their own, to see if they could get it working on their own. If not, then it was feeding it back into where they could have contact with individuals who could then give them hands-on help. The other thing that we did is online training, and this is a case where I always say, and this goes back to I'm actually retired from the military, and one of the sayings we always had was I'd rather be lucky than good. I mentioned we were talking about Skype for Business, and we were getting ready to do a migration from Skype for Business to Teams. That actually was due to happen in late March. Obviously, all of that got put on hold when the pandemic started, but we had some online training set up. It's actually going to be online and on-site training with a focus on moving from Skype for Business to Teams. We were able to rapidly shift that over the space of a couple of weeks. We shifted it all to online training. And as a result, we ended up getting 1-hour training sessions that over 10,000 people in the department were able to participate in. So that was a huge bump up, but it showed us that the online training can be effective. It's not the end all. It's not going to be the end to what we have to do to get people to totally adopt Teams, but it certainly got us off to a good start. The last thing were policy changes. And as Kevin mentioned, it was like some of these things seemed to be happening overnight. One of the first things we did was limited guest access. So the guest access allows people from outside of your organization to come in and actually participate as a member of a team. We limited that to other federal agencies, but as Kevin mentioned, and as I've mentioned, a lot of the interaction that we have is with other federal agencies. And so what we found is internally people were adopting Teams. They were getting a lot of their information organized on Teams. They were coordinating the documents, and then they said, oh, but I need to share this information with people outside of the State Department in other federal agencies. And that guest access has been turned on as it has been working very well. The second piece was telephone audio conferencing. So many people didn't fully understand in the beginning that they could actually, using this remote access on their personal devices, that the microphones and the cameras were functioning, or people were set up on devices where they didn't have that capability. And so as we transitioned to all of these Teams meetings, there were people who needed to dial in. So in the beginning, we had the standardized conference calling card. So whoever was setting up the Teams meeting was typing in that phone number. And as I said, we found that those calling cards became overwhelmed and some of them weren't functioning. There's an audio conferencing function in Teams that we worked with Microsoft, so we could turn that on. Just for those of you who are interested in Teams, it's a per license setting for us. We're on an E3 license. And what that does is automatically provide a telephone number when you set up a Teams meeting so people can dial in. And it also, there are local phone numbers from like 40 different countries around the world. So it was also very useful for us around the world. So those were two rapid policy changes we made over the space of just a week or so that have really enhanced our ability, or people's ability, to use Teams very effectively. So here are some of our challenges. We are still now pretty much certainly domestically all teleworking. We know that at some point we're going to begin a phased approach where we're going to come back to on-site. And one of our big challenges is how do we keep this momentum when we return to on-site? And we actually are thinking about that in two ways. One would be sort of, as we talked about, the meetings and the calls, and how people can continue to use those tools both when they're on site and off site. People have demonstrated that they certainly can use them off site. One of the things on site is most of our locations, I'd say the great majority of our locations, we do not have microphones or cameras on our desktop applications, on our desktop computers. There's been a policy change that is going to allow that in a lot of our environment, not all of it, but that will mean, for instance, that when people come back to their workplace, they can be at their desktop on site, and if they want to do a Teams call, they still can. And we anticipate they're going to want to do Teams calls because as we do our phased approach, we anticipate that no more than about 40% of our workforce is going to be back in the workplace. And so there's still going to be a lot of people teleworking. The other thing is we don't want people to regress to their old habits. So as Kevin mentioned, they're very much familiar with potentially when you have to clear a document, you're going to attach it to an email, you're going to send it around, you're going to have multiple versions. We want to keep them in Teams and to get them using the collaborative features of Teams. That means we're going to have to continue to work on change management, user adoption, continue to show them how this can be advantageous to them. And I mentioned the policy changes that have happened where, we can allow cameras in the workplace on certain desktops. And so you can see we've done a lot. It's happened quickly, but the last point I'd like to share with you is that this user adoption takes a long time and it's a continued effort. So even though we ramped up, we jumped from 10,000 users to 40,000 users, that's a huge step. It got us going a lot faster than we anticipated, but it's going to take a long time, especially because Teams is really transformative because it brings together the communications and the collaboration piece. And so the only piece of advice I would give to everyone is be ready for a long haul and continue to just keep working on it.
Great, thanks, Tim. So that's really the end of our story, but we're open for questions. Before we leave, just a reminder to stop by the raffle and also to look at the various charity relief funds that this conference is supporting. And if you feel so led to give a donation to those funds, I believe 10% of all the funds that are raised by this conference from vendors are going to these charity organizations. Last note I'll make is for those of you out there who are IT people, and I suspect that's most of you, but who are also US citizens and interested in a different type of career where on any given day you could be supporting teams or fixing a plane or many other different things, I'd encourage you to stop by careers.state.gov to look at opportunities. Look for the link to Foreign Service Specialist and Information Management Specialist is my skill code and what it came in to the Department of State about 20 years ago. So it's been a great career for me, and I really enjoy being able to use technology in ways that further our nation's mission and core objectives. So if there are any questions, please go ahead and put them up in the Q&A pod, and we'll stick around for a while to try to answer any questions.